Moving on to this 10-mark question. With reference to Extract C, assess possible reasons why many landline-only customers do not switch to a cheaper telephone provider. First thing that should pop into your mind, very small part of your spec, is to do with more behavioural economics. We call it consumer inertia. What is consumer inertia? Essentially, it's the concept where consumers do not switch to cheaper providers. Essentially, they're quite comfortable with the current provider. They can't really be bothered to switch, and they overestimate the cost of switching or how hard it is to switch. And this probably relates to you a lot, for example, with mobile providers. For example, no one really switches unless you're out of contract because it's just easier to remain. But what does this therefore mean? Consumer inertia, in the end of the day, this is a behavioural economics link, but what does it in the end lead to? It leads to a slight degree of inelastic demand. Why is that? So even if consumers aren't getting the best deal they could be due to consumer inertia, it therefore will mean that these consumers will have a degree of inelastic demand. As like I said, they're paying higher prices than they should be paying. And then let's have a look at Extract C for some other reasons. And even before looking at the extract, you can probably just think of some reasons. So why some people might not switch to a cheaper telephone provider. Talking about the demographics of population, like a lot of these questions, you can probably even deduce them without the extract. So let's have a look at this Extract C. Okay, so this talks about the telephone only contract. It is falling about £7 a month. After regulator attacked existing deals as poor value for money. This will save million landline customers £84 a year. And now this is a very interesting bit, because the bills for landline only customers, nearly 2/3 of whom are over 65. Now, why is that interesting? Why is this demographic of this population interesting? As of course, old people are not as teched up as young people. Therefore, how is that going to affect the ability to switch? They don't, very simply, they don't have the information. It is definitely imperfect information, an information gap, asymmetric information. This is definitely an example of an information gap, as these elderly individuals do not have the correct information, don't know how to do it. Therefore, it means that they will end up overpaying. Thus, of course, that is a misallocation of resources. And then, of course, towards the bottom of this paragraph as well, so Ofcom focused on BT because they account for 2/3 of the 1.5 million landline only customers. And then it talks about the dominant position of BT. So essentially, what is this talking about? It's essentially talking about monopoly power they have. And then essentially just talks about how BT is in prime position to exploit these customers. And a great stat to back this up: line rental charges have increased around 47% in the last few years, whereas the costs have fallen 27%. So they're really increasing their profit margins. And then towards the end, looking for measures to help people shop around for better deals with more confidence. Of course, that's a great link to things like price comparison sites, things like Go Compare. So first things first, what is inertia classed as? What do we learn it in the spec as? It is irrational behaviour, and it's irrational behaviour by consumers. Okay, and the example of inertia here I'm going to give is from the extract where it mentions, I believe it mentions 1/3 of BT's customers haven't yet. So one quarter of BT's landline customers have never switched. That is a great example for inertia. So what I'm going to say is that we assume in economics that consumers are rational. They make decisions to maximise their utility, and one thing that would maximise their utility in this scenario is lowering their costs. However, as we know, consumers, due to certain things, are irrational. And we can see that with, again, in the extract, it mentions how the price of these lines, these landlines, have increased from around 23 to 47%, but individuals are still not switching. And why is that? Of course, that could be because they find it difficult to switch. They have brand loyalty. They just genuinely can't be bothered to switch. Therefore, it means despite BT increasing the price, the quantity demanded is not falling significantly. If you saw that on the diagram, of course, it would look something like this, which of course, what does that represent? Inelastic demand. So that's how I would write that paragraph. Let's now move on to the evaluation stage of the paragraph. So essentially, we're saying that they have inelastic demand as they continue paying higher prices, despite, even though they pretty much shouldn't be. But again, I'm going to evaluate this with a bit of application, which is right at the start of the extract, where essentially it says that Ofcom or the CMA is going to step in and is going to force the BT to drop its prices from £18.99 to £11.99. Thus, it basically means that consumers will not be being exploited and there's less inertia. As if now consumers are getting a good deal, there's no reason to switch, so they can comfortably stay with BT. So Edward, however, in evaluation, this depends on the degree of regulation by either Ofcom or CMA. So that's how to word that evaluation point there. Of course, you can go into a bit more depth with it, but now let's get started with our second paragraph. So the second paragraph, of course, is going to be on like the elderly side of things. So it's going to be on information gaps. You can go into specifics of which information gap you want to mention. You could mention like things like asymmetric information, incomplete information. But yeah. So my application here, I believe it says that either 1/3 or 1/4 of BT customers were, 2/3 of the landline customers were over 65, which of course is a great web application to use. So the next chain is going to be essentially just talk about how they struggle to access things like comparison sites like Go Compare due to a lack of digital literacy, and then of course why that leads to them sticking to the same deal. So I've just written that out just to help explain it. So due to information gaps, A.G 2/3 of BT landline customers are over 65. Therefore, they struggle to access things like comparison sites. Comparison sites is a really good thing to always mention. It links to a really good part of the spec of technological change. Of course, comparison sites allowed for things like this, but of course they help solve that gap of information. But due to limited digital skills, it means they have incomplete information with regards to alternative providers and prices. This imperfect information, which is just another word for incomplete information, leads to a misallocation of resources, as these consumers are not aware of the lower cost decisions. Therefore, they allocate their resources incorrectly, as essentially, if they had complete information, if they knew all the prices in the market, it is likely that they would spend their money somewhere else. They'd spend it at a cheaper alternative, but as they have incomplete information, they have a lack of information. They will allocate their resources here, whereas in reality, therefore that meaning is a misallocation of resources. But yeah, that's a really good point. Now let's move on to evaluation. Now, I think a really good evaluation point here is kind of undermining BT to a massive extent, where I think in the previous paragraph we talked about 1/4 of BT customers have never switched. But I think you could really evaluate that by saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether there is a lack of information, whether the only reason consumers are not switching is due to the information gap, as consumers may actually just prefer BT, they may prefer the reliability, and they may just have a preference where they want to stick to BT. So we're just saying that 1/4 of consumers have never switched because of inertia, whereas that might not be true, or due to information gaps, where that might not be true, as they might just stick to BT as they have a good reputation. They like BT, for example, it's good customer service. So you could argue that it's actually it's to BT's credit rather than to consumers' downfall. And then a really good second evaluation point you can mention is on the time frame, where you could talk about digital literacy, essentially, where we say that these consumers, the elderly, they're not switching due to they don't have the digital literacy. But you could talk about in the long run, as like, for example, me, as we get older, we will have much better and digital literacy with things like courses, things like campaigns is improving. Then we could talk about in the long run, digital literacy will improve, therefore information gaps will not be a reason why consumers do not switch. So in the short run, yes, this may be a problem, but in the long run, with digital literacy improving, it will therefore no longer be a problem. So however, in evaluation, this depends on the time frame.